Hello, I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and welcome to Lecture 3, Arguments for Logic and Critical Thinking. In our previous lecture, Lecture 2, we basically laid out the conceptual groundwork for all the important terms that we'll be employing throughout the rest of the course. We talked about things like issues, claims, arguments, very general stuff that we need to start becoming familiar with. And so we talked about part of that lecture then was talking about, in a general sense, what an argument is. We talked about the two basic ingredients, premises and conclusions, and we went through, for example, an argument and sort of the process of approaching it and highlighting the conclusion and then searching for the premises and so on. And I mentioned, in the next lecture, so this lecture, we will be taking a much closer look into arguments themselves. And so that's what we're doing here. We're going to take the microscope and direct it towards, arguments. We're going to talk more about and more in depth about what exactly an argument is. When do we have an argument present versus when don't we? And that can be a pretty tricky sort of endeavor. I'm going to outline what I think is kind of a helpful general two-step process in terms of approaching arguments, okay, figuring out if we have one and what kind of argument it is, and then how good it is. And so I'll go through this in much more depth then. And we'll also talk about, the two types of arguments. So all arguments that we're going to be confronted with can be classified into one of two types, right? Deductive and inductive. So we'll start talking about those two kinds of arguments in much more detail. Now, what's interesting is, so this is the last lecture for this first section of the course. In the next section, what we do then is actually take that microscope and we, magnify things even more. We'll go into the deductive arguments themselves and spend 2 chapters talking totally about just deductive arguments, going through the different types, truth functional logic, and so on. And then also we'll turn our attention to inductive arguments and talking about them in detail. So that'll be the looking ahead then in section 2 of the course. We'll be talking about arguments in even much more detail. But we're going to go through again and kind of get a taste for those two different types, deductive and inductive, in this lecture. And then again, the idea is in the next section we'll dive into much more detail with respect to both those. I'll go through some common mistakes to try to avoid when it comes to approaching arguments, figuring out if you have an argument present, what type of argument it is. Right? There's some in assessing them. There's some common, rookie mistakes, if you will, that students tend to make that I want to try to put on your radar so that you can try to, best avoid them. We'll also talk about then, as they did in the textbook, sort of one way or strategy to try to gain clarity with respect to arguments is to try to diagram them. And so they went through, some typical conventional steps in the text, right? So again, this is chapter 2 of the textbook, 2 kinds of reasoning. And so they talk about the conventional steps of, or standard, typical steps that a lot of logicians will employ to diagram arguments. And so we'll go through those conventions, sort of discuss these general steps. And the idea then again is by diagramming the argument, you can hopefully make things a little bit clearer, right? Because a lot of times when we're confronted with these arguments, it's just a bunch of verbiage at first, and it can be hard to kind of sift through things and even figure out if there is an argument there, let alone, what the point of it is, right? Or what the conclusion is and what the premises are and so on. So diagramming can definitely be helpful. And we'll conclude this lecture then by talking about logical window dressing, things that we want to be on the lookout for that can creep in and mess things up for logicians, right? When we're trying to assess, identify and assess arguments. Things that are sort of can be tricky because might come across, right, as being part of arguments or strengthening arguments when really they have, strictly speaking, right, no bearing on the logical merit of what's being said. So again, that's referred to as kind of logical window dressing, and we'll explore some ways that happens, rhetorical devices and so on, and things that are employed that, again, strictly speaking, don't really have any bearing on the actual arguments, right? They're just window dressing, trying to make things seem more convincing or persuasive than they really are, from a logician's perspective. Anyway, so let's go ahead and dive into the lecture then and talk here about, first of all, what is an argument, okay? And that can be pretty tricky. We talked about the general ingredients of what an argument is in the last lecture. But here my point is, right, that it can be tricky. So even if I need to look for a premise and I need to look for a conclusion, right, in order to even have an argument. Given that kind of basic knowledge, it can still be oftentimes very tricky to discern whether in fact there is an argument or not present, okay? A lot of times we might be inclined to think there's an argument present, due to maybe rhetorical devices, or for whatever reason, when in fact there's not an argument present. And it also works the other way, right? We might, because maybe there's an unstated premise or unstated conclusion even, we might think there's not an argument present when in fact there is, or the person intends for there to be one. So again, you have to get good at, and that's kind of, one of the main goals of this chapter is to get good at sort of discerning, and that takes practice, right? And so that's what a lot of the exercises are for, right? Giving you practice in, what is an explanation versus an argument, right? That's a classic sort of tricky one, right? When you have because, and we'll go through some examples here in a couple of slides, few slides from now. But that can be an especially tricky sort of situation. What's an explanation versus an argument? Okay, so as I stated on the top of slide 2, it can be difficult, but you need to be able to discern, and again, with practice helps, to tell what exactly is not an argument, right? You have to be able to distinguish statements, mere statements, things that aren't necessarily meant to have one statement support another. Maybe it's just a list of statements or a list of facts. Mere statements, explanations, as I said, and rhetoric. You have to be able to distinguish all that from then arguments, the arguments themselves. Okay. So, for example, I mentioned a list of facts. As the authors point out on page 47, a lot of times we can get a list of facts, a list of statements, and because they have to do with the same thing, right, it can be easy to think then that, well, there must be an argument present. But just because you have a list of facts related to the same thing doesn't mean that the person offering those list of facts is intending for some of those facts or statements to support, right, believing others, okay? And that's what you need for an argument. So again, just because you have a list of facts, a list of statements doesn't mean that there's necessarily an argument present. So, and I like their example. So again, they talk about this on page 47. I like the example they use. So, here's an example. Identity theft is up at least tenfold over last year. More people have learned how easy it is to get hold of another social security number, bank account numbers, and such. The local police department reminds everyone to keep close watch on who has access to such information. If you pay close attention there, strictly speaking, you just have, 3 statements, okay? A list of facts, 3 facts. They're probably all true, right? But there's no argument there. There's not one statement or multiple statements that are offered to then try to convince us of another one. No, they're just listed, right? As if there's general knowledge, or you can easily go and see this stuff, right? They're not, whoever is offering this is not trying to convince us of something. Okay? At least it's not explicit here. And as I mentioned, the bottom bullet point on slide 2, it can work the other way too, right? So oftentimes in real life, so to speak, right, arguments, it can be tricky to discern that there's an argument present, right? We might be inclined to construe that there is no argument presented when in fact there might be. And that can be tricky because in real life, so to speak, right, oftentimes, for example, premises go unstated because we think they're so obvious. And so I think one of their examples was like, the car breaks down a lot, we should get a new car, right? Somebody says that. There's actually an unstated premise there. Whenever your car breaks down a lot, you should get a new car, okay? And so the general point again is that you have to, be careful as well to make sure that you're recognizing things that might simply be implied and not stated explicitly, okay? Because if you fail to recognize an unstated premise, you might fail to recognize that the person is trying to offer an argument. Okay? And they talk about that. Let's see, pages 36 to 37. They give some examples and go through, how that can be tricky. So moving on to slide 3, they mention this somewhere in the text as well. But for an argument, you don't need 2 people present, let alone 2 people feuding. And it doesn't matter how much I emphasize this. I always have some students, when they're asked to define an argument, they'll say, well, when 2 people are mad at each other or going back and forth and rebutting one another. No, to have an argument present, you don't need 2 people present. You could just be trying to gain clarity in your own mind. What sort of car should I buy, for example? And you might be laying out the arguments right to yourself for car X and car Y and car Z. there's not two people involved necessarily, right? So again, two people aren't required. Okay, there doesn't have to be a feud involved. Okay, you can just be seeking your own clarity, for example. Okay, so the bottom line, an argument consists of at least two claims. Okay, there have to be at least two claims there, right? Because you need at least a premise, which is a claim, and a conclusion, which is a claim. Okay? So again, an argument consists of at least two two claims. And again, an important feature of these claims, as I note on slide 3, is that what we mean by a claim is it's something that's believed or expressed that it's either true or false, right? So again, an argument consists of at least two claims that are either true or false, and at least one of the claims has to be offered as a reason for believing another of the claims. Right? So that's the key. As the authors point out, and I mentioned on the bottom slide 3, so this comes from page 56 of the textbook, quote, the key here is determining whether the speaker or writer is offering reasons intended to support or demonstrate one or more claims. Right? Are they trying to convince us of something? Okay, if that lack of an attempt to convince us of something is there, then you don't have an argument. Okay, maybe you just have a list of facts, as we suggested a moment ago. Okay? So I mentioned a moment ago as well that distinguishing arguments from explanations can be tricky, and so I wanted to spend a little bit more time, and it's the point of slide 4, discussing, distinguishing arguments from explanations, because again, it can be pretty tricky, and they do that on page 48 of the text. Right, so again, an explanation simply identifies the cause of a problem. Okay, it doesn't offer, in the whole key here, right, one claim in support of another. Right, and there's not that when there's an explanation at play, there's not that element of the person trying to convince us of something. Okay, that's always there with an argument. Okay? So they point out on page 48, quote, arguing that a dog has fleas is different from explaining what gave it fleas. And that's again from page 48. And I like their example. Mikey is in his swimsuit because he was swimming. So let's take a time here. And where's my eraser? I lost my eraser. And put these up here because I think this is a good example. Okay, so on the one hand, we have Mikey is in his swimsuit because he was swimming. Okay, take that, and I'm sorry about the space here. Verse, Mikey was swimming because he's in his swimsuit. Okay. So again, they seem pretty similar, right? And you have that word because, but one is an explanation and one ought to be construed as an argument. Okay? And it's critically important, as the authors point out, that we become comfortable, right, and well practiced in distinguishing these. Why is the first one an explanation and the second one an argument? Well, look at how they're expressed. Mikey's in his swimsuit because he was swimming, right? That seems to just kind of presume that this is the case, right? They're not trying to convince us that this is the case, right? They're just explaining why it is the case. It's almost like this is just, obvious, right? There again, the idea is there doesn't seem to be the intent to convince us that this is the case, right? Whereas this, right, that does seem to be the case, right? What follows because is not simply explaining this, it's trying to give us evidence for thinking this is the case. Mikey was swimming, after all, he's in his swimsuit, right? So explanation versus an argument, and I think that's a good example, and it's indicative, right? It's a good example because it's indicative of how very similar these can come across, right? And so we have to be discerning here, okay, and be able to tell why the one, right, there is an argument at play, or seems to be an argument at play, because, right, what follows because seems to be something on offer to convince us of this, whereas when in the explanation, right, that element of trying to convince us of this is not there. Okay? Okay, so again, hopefully that makes some sense. Also, slide 5, I think it's important to emphasize that it's one thing to try to offer an argument, right? And it's another thing to try to persuade someone of something. And so the authors, I think, this is a good point on their part, right? Spending time pointing out that these are two distinct endeavors. Okay? Not all arguments are aimed at persuading, right, necessarily, right? And not all, for sure, not all attempts to persuade entail arguments. Okay? So, and as I point out in slide 5 again, this is a very common sort of mistake that people can make, right? Construing attempts at persuasion, right? When there is no argument, construing that as there being an argument there, and then vice versa, right? Always assuming that arguments are an attempt to persuade when that's not necessarily the case. So, as the authors, reflect on, and this is the 9th edition, 13th page of the 9th edition, quote, not all arguments attempt to persuade, and many attempts to persuade do not involve arguments. You might just be laying out arguments for the heck of it, right? I mean, and not trying to persuade anyone of anything, just going through some arguments, right? So, just because you see an argument doesn't mean that it was necessarily offered in an attempt to persuade someone of something. Okay? It's oftentimes the case, but not necessarily. Okay? And for sure, when you see attempts to persuade, as they pointed out, rightfully so, if your goal is to persuade someone of something, unfortunately, rational arguments are not your number one tool. There's all kinds of other tools you can use that don't entail arguments. Okay? So, for example, as I mentioned on the bottom bullet point of slide 5, flattery, repetition, propaganda, oftentimes these don't entail arguments at all. In fact, if you want to persuade someone of something, this is well known at this point, repetition is your number one tool oftentimes. Just repeat something often enough, and it doesn't matter how ludicrous it is, it starts to resonate in the people's minds that hear it. Okay? That's why advertising in some sense is so effective, right? You just hear it often enough, hear something often enough, right? And it becomes ingrained in your, I don't know how you put it, your subconscious. It's there, and it's more impactful then, right? Research bears this out. So again, we want to be sort of aware of this idea that persuasion and arguments, okay, oftentimes go hand in hand, but they are distinct endeavors, right? Offering arguments and being on the receiving end of arguments, being able to discern what the arguments are versus the superfluous stuff that's merely attempting to persuade us, right? We need to be cognizant of this kind of stuff. Right? All right. So we talked a bit about what exactly an argument is, and emphasizing the need to be able to distinguish when in fact there is an argument here and when in fact there is not an argument here. Okay? Let's go ahead and talk about in general the process. I think anyway, a helpful sort of overview or general process. How do I want to put this? A general process for approaching arguments. Okay? I always like to start here. I like to think of it as entailing a kind of two-step process. Okay? Hence 1, 2. And then interestingly, within each of those main 2 steps, we also then have 2 minor steps, if you will, hence these like check boxes. Okay? So when you have a bunch of mumbo jumbo in front of you, or a bunch of words, or somebody just spouted off a bunch of stuff to you, right? Your first task as a logician, or at least insofar as you're concerned with the arguments at play, is to, as I call it, right, engage in the identification process. That part, step 1, right? And ask yourself, so step 1 of step 1, is there actually an argument present? And so we've talked about ways to discern that and figure that out, okay? And we're hopefully getting better and better. Again, the more practice you have at this, the better you'll get, right? But we want to be able to discern whether or not, in fact, there is an argument present. Okay, yes, I have what seems to be a claim that's offered in support of another claim, okay? So we have an argument. Step 2 of this first part, if you will, the identification process, is then to ask, well, what kind of argument is it? Okay, what kind of argument is present? And so that'll get then into the 2 types, right, that we'll get more into here in a second, deductive and inductive arguments. Okay, all arguments, okay, at least in terms of our class and how we're proceeding. Okay? All arguments are classified into one of two types. Okay? They're either deductive or inductive. And we'll get into, again, the differentiating factor in a moment, how you figure that out. But that's the second step of this identification process, right? So one, is there an argument present? Yes, there is. Okay, well then I need to figure out whether it's deductive or inductive. Again, more on that in a moment, how you go about figuring that out, okay? Second step, and I would say arguably the more important step, right, is the assessment. Okay, we don't want to just know if there's an argument there or what type of argument it is, right? We also want to know, more importantly, whether or not we ought to be convinced, whether we ought to be buying into that argument's conclusion or what the person's trying to convince us of, right? We want to be able to assess it then, right? So we've already done the identification process. We said, hey, there's an argument present, and let's say, yes, it was deductive, okay? So now we need to figure out whether that argument's any good. So this is where we get into our assessment terms, okay? So these on the left, and hopefully this will become more and more clear as we proceed, okay? So there's kind of two steps, just as there was in the first part, right? Step one, you're going to do what I and the authors of the textbook refer to as the logic or reasoning part, okay? You're going to assess the argument for that. And then step two, you're going to assess the argument for its truth part. And that'll become more clear here in a moment what we mean by that. Okay, but then the terms you use, which terms you use depends on whether you've identified the argument as deductive or inductive, okay? If it's deductive, then you'll use the concepts of validity and soundness, okay? If it's alternatively inductive, so you've recognized there's an argument there and you've labeled it inductive, then you're going to use the concepts of strength and cogency, which, by the way, I don't know why, but the authors of our textbook do not employ the concept of cogency, and you are going to need to be familiar with it. Fortunately, although we use different conceptual terms when assessing deductive and inductive arguments, as we'll see as we proceed here, what you're doing when you assess the validity of a deductive argument is very similar to what you're doing when you assess the strength of an inductive argument. And so too, what you're doing when you assess the soundness of a deductive argument is very similar to what you're doing when you assess the cogency of an inductive argument. Okay? So for right now, right, we're just talking generally here, the overall process. Okay, step one, identification. Ask yourself, is there an argument present? Yes. Okay, well, what kind of is it? It's inductive. Okay, so now I need to assess this argument's strength because I've labeled it inductive, and we'll talk about what that means here in a moment. And then I need to assess its cogency. More on that here in a moment. Now, I guess real quick, what do I mean by, why am I calling it the logic or reasoning part, and why am I calling this the truth part? That'll become more clear as we continue, but real quick, I want to put this on your radar, why that is. What we're up to when we assess an argument's validity, or if it's inductive, its strength, is we're asking ourselves, and I know we've kind of referenced this task in previous lectures, but how well are the things offered in support, right? The reasons given, the premises, how well do they actually support the connection, right? They're intended to support the connection, or conclusion rather, but how well do they in fact, right, support, or if it's a deductive argument, prove, do they in fact prove the conclusion, okay? That's what we're assessing when we do this first step, okay? The logic or the reasoning part here. How well are these connected? Never mind whether these reasons are in fact true, okay? And that's where it can get tricky, because sometimes we might have a ludicrous premise, right? One that's obviously false. And so it can seem weird to some people to nevertheless call this a valid, or if it's an inductive argument, a strong argument. But sometimes that might be the case, right? You might have, if it's a deductive argument, a valid deductive argument with just crazy, obviously false premises, okay? But, it would still be a valid argument provided, right, if these reasons were true, they would prove the conclusion in the case of a deductive argument. Okay? Never mind whether the premises are in fact true. Okay? We don't care about that with this first assessment step, if you will. Okay? When we care about the truth part, right, is the second step. So when we assess the soundness of a deductive argument, or alternatively the cogency of an inductive argument, that's where we're then going in and actually analyzing the truth of the premises. Okay. Okay. So hopefully that you find that helpful to kind of back up a bit and think of this in a general sense at first, right? And what exactly we're up to here. So we've asked ourselves, is an argument present? Yes, there is. We've identified the argument, whether it be deductive or inductive, as being such, right? And then we're going to assess it, okay? We're going to say whether it's valid or invalid if it's deductive, or whether it's strong or weak if it's inductive. And then we're going to say whether it's sound or unsound if it's deductive, or whether it's cogent or not cogent if it's inductive, okay? Okay, so moving on to slide 7, this is where we're going to home in on the difference, the critical factor. What is the difference, right? Going back to this, how do I determine whether an argument is deductive or inductive? It's actually pretty straightforward, okay? So what I'm doing on slide 7 is, telling you in brief how to distinguish, deductive versus inductive arguments, and then again referring to these assessment terms. So that's what I'm up to again on slide 7. But as I mentioned, right, when you're going to identify an argument and ask yourself, well, is this deductive or inductive? When it comes to deductive arguments and identifying them, the key here is that conclusion is thought to necessarily follow given the form of the argument itself. And so we'll go on a little bit more on what I mean by that, this form. The idea is no matter what you plug in, okay, the person offering a deductive argument, okay, they're thinking, the key is they think they can prove or demonstrate or guarantee that the conclusion has to be true. Okay? If there's that element of the person who's offering the argument thinks that this has to be the case, the conclusion has to be the case, then it's deductive. If alternatively, and so that's, again, I'm going through this on slide 7, if they think that instead they're just, given these premises, you have good reason to think this is true or going to follow, but they don't think they've proven it or has to be the case necessarily, right? There's that element of necessity missing. Rather, they just think they're just supporting it, right? It's not necessarily going to be the case, but there's a strong likelihood, right, that it's going to be the case. That's inductive. Okay, so the key differentiating factor is whether there's that element of necessity at play. Does the person offering the argument, do they think the conclusion has to be the case no matter what? Would they bet their life that the conclusion is the case? That's kind of a way I put it sometimes, right? Is does the person who's offering the argument, right, are they willing to bet their life, literally, right? Because there might be smart bets where you don't necessarily know something's going to happen, right? But your life, let's assume if you're going to bet your life, right, you're 100% sure the conclusion's going to be the case. Okay, if they're willing to bet their life that the conclusion that they're offering in their argument is the case, okay, then it's going to be deductive, right? And they might be wrong, right? But if the person offering the argument thinks this has to be the case, right? This has to be the case given this, right? That is your signal then that it's deductive. Okay, they might be wrong, but if that is their intention, if that's what they think, I guess the weather doesn't like deductive arguments, right? If they think, right, that this has to follow given their premises, whether or not they're right in thinking that, deductive, and that would be a deductive argument. But again, if they think they're just supporting, they're not willing to bet their life, they might have a very, very, very strong inductive argument, right? Assuming these premises are the case, it's very, 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 very likely that this is going to be the case. They're still granting, right, there's not that element of necessity. It still might be the case that this doesn't follow, right? That's the key to an inductive argument, right? No matter how strong it is, there's still that possibility that the conclusion won't follow, even if these are true, okay? So in general, that's the key to identifying them. I want to say for a second, because the way I mentioned to identify deductive arguments, right, is there's this idea that given the form itself of the argument, the conclusion, right, that the conclusion has to be the case given the form. Okay, so let me give you an example of that. So this is called modus ponens. We're going to become more and more and more and more familiar with this valid deductive form of argumentation as we proceed throughout the course. But so this is modus ponens. Okay. This is always a valid form of deductive argumentation. So what it looks like is this. And I know this is pretty confusing for you at this point. I'll spell this out a little bit more here in a second. This will actually be much more clear in the second section of the course. because we're going to get into a lot more of this stuff. So what this basically, this is a valid form of deductive argumentation. And so the point here is that it doesn't matter what we plug in, okay, what verbiage we throw in here, if what the person's expressing, right, the underlying form is this, it's always going to be valid, and it's going to be a deductive argument. Okay. Not only is it going to be construed as deductive, but it will always be a valid deductive argument, given this underlying form. And so that's the key. So if he's late for class, so the way this reads is, if this is the case, then this will be the case. And then this is saying, well, this is the case. Okay. And so given what was said here, if we assume these are correct, right, we said given P is the case, then Q will be the case. And then we're told, well, P is the case. Okay, well, then Q is going to follow. That's the conclusion of the argument. Well, that's going to be true given if these are assumed to be true, right? So that's why this is said to be valid, and that's why this is kind of entailed, right? The idea is it's necessary, okay, given the form of the argument itself, right? So it doesn't matter what we plug in, okay, we can plug in a whole slew of things. If it's a cat, it's an animal. It's a cat, it's an animal. It doesn't matter what the person says. Again, if the underlying form is this, it will be not only a deductive argument, right? Because there's that element of necessity involved in the conclusion, right? The premises entail the conclusion. It's going to be a valid too. Okay, now I'll go ahead and throw this up. That sounded weird, but throw this up. Affirming the consequent. Now, this gets interesting because the person offering this, they think, so we will still label this as a deductive argument because the person thinks that the reasons they're giving entail or necessitate us believing the conclusion, but they actually there's a fallacy involved here. They made a mistake, right? Because the way this one works, right? If P then Q, and then we're told Q, and then they want us to conclude therefore P, okay? So the reason, again, even though so the person offering this says something like, if it's a cat, then it's an animal. It's an animal, therefore it's a cat. Well, that doesn't follow, right? Just because we know whatever it is an animal, right? We have no license to infer that it's a cat, given what was said here. Okay, so this is actually invalid, and it's a very common fallacy, right? It's a very common form of a deductive argument that's invalid. Okay, so even though, strictly speaking, the person whoever says that, even though they think they've proven their conclusion, they haven't actually, and that's why we label it invalid. Okay, but I'm just pointing out here, right, that point about form, right? There's something about the form, right, that where the conclusion seems to be entailed by what is being said, or at least that's what the person thinks. Okay, whereas with inductive arguments, again, that element of necessity is not there. Okay, so my classic example. So I also oftentimes say like all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's an example of a deductive argument. Okay? Assuming those first two claims are true, that last claim has to be the case. Okay? That is an example of a deductive argument. Okay, you would bet your life on the conclusion. Okay? Whereas there's a strong south wind today, or there was a strong south wind yesterday, therefore it's going to rain today. The person saying that, they might bet a bunch of money because maybe they're familiar with, weather statistics and they know it's a very strong likelihood. It still might be a smart bet. They might bet the farm, so to speak, that it's going to rain today. But no matter how many times in the past, it might be 99% of the time that it's, when it's had, we had a 20-mile-per-hour wind yesterday, it's rained today. There's still that chance, right, that it won't happen this time. Okay? There's that lacking of that entailment or that element of necessity at play, right? So just because there's a 20+ mile-per-hour wind yesterday, right, there's a very, very strong likelihood that it's going to rain. We still wouldn't bet our life, right, that it's going to rain because we know there's still a chance it won't. Okay, so we need to get good at differentiating all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. An argument like that from there was a strong 20-mile-per-hour wind yesterday, therefore it's going to rain today. Okay, there are two different kinds of arguments. Okay, one is deductive and one is inductive. Okay, so, and again, that factor around which they differ is that element of necessity. Okay, does the person, whether they're correct in thinking so or not, right? Does the person think that whatever reasons they give, okay, do they think that necessitates this, whatever their conclusion is, or do they just think they're supporting it? Okay. The former is deductive and the latter is inductive. Okay. And so as I mentioned then, if you deduce or identify an argument as being deductive, then as I mentioned on slide 7, you're going to employ the concepts of validity and soundness. If you identify an argument as inductive, you'll employ the assessment terms of strength and cogency. Okay, let's go ahead and take a closer look then at deductive arguments in particular here. So these are two forms associated with deductive arguments. One is a good form, so to speak, right? It's a valid deductive argument. One, although common, right, is invalid. So the person offering this, they think they're proving this, but they're not, right? Because we can assume these are true, and this can still be false. Right? And you will be becoming much more familiar with this sort of stuff as we proceed throughout the course, especially in the next section, section 2. So as I mentioned, or I quote the authors from page 37 at the top of slide 8, quote, the premise or premises of a good deductive argument, if true, proves or demonstrates, these being the same thing for our purposes, its conclusion. Okay, there's that element of proving, demonstrating, necessitating the conclusion. Okay, so again, we're talking about deductive right now. Let's go ahead and put that up here. Okay. So the first thing we want to talk about with respect to deductive arguments are these conceptual terms, right? So we kind of alluded to them. We have the idea of much better. The idea of validity and soundness. Okay, these are the conceptual terms. So we identify there's an argument present. We identified it as deductive because we're at least it seems to be the case that the person offering the argument thinks their conclusion has to be the case given their premises. So now we're on step 2, right, of the overall process. We want to assess this deductive argument. So the first thing we do is we inquire into its validity. So this is an on-off switch. Every argument that's deductive, right, is either valid, and what I mean by an on-off switch is either one or the other, right? It's an either-or sort of situation, or it's invalid. So every deductive argument is either valid or invalid, every one of them. Okay. So what do we mean if we're saying it's valid versus what do we mean if we're saying it's invalid? And I've kind of hinted at it and certainly implied what it meant, in the discussions of previous slides. But as I point out in slide 8, a deductive argument is valid if and only if it is not possible for the conclusion to be false if we assume the premises are true. So a key feature or a key point here is that when you're concerned with validity, you do not care whether, remember this is the logic or reasoning part, you don't care whether or not the premises, the reasons given, are in fact true. Set that aside. All you're asking is, assuming they're true, right, do they necessitate the conclusion? If I assume these are true, does this have to be true? Because that's what the person thinks, right? They're doing, right? They're proving their conclusion. That's the key to a deductive argument, right? Identifying it as a deductive argument. So when it comes to validity, we're asking, if I assume these are true, does this have to be true? If the answer is no, if you can assume the premise or premises are true and the conclusion can still be false, then it's invalid. Okay? Otherwise, if when you assume these are true, this has to be true, this has to be the case, like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, if those are true, presume those are true, then Socrates is mortal, right? That has to be the case. If that's the case, right, if we assume the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, then it's valid. Okay? So an on-off switch, it's always, every deductive argument is either valid or invalid. Okay? Now, we have this idea of soundness. Likewise, every deductive argument is either, it's an on-off switch again, sound or unsound. Okay? So what do we mean here? I like to, again, I have some corny ways of referring to things in this course. I like to refer to soundness as going above and beyond the call of validity, and here's why. To label a deductive argument as sound, two things have to be the case. One, it has to be valid. Okay? So if you have already identified a deductive argument as invalid, boom, right away, it's already unsound. Okay? If you can't check off valid, you know it's unsound. So again, invalid, automatically unsound. Okay? So if we know an argument is sound, we know it's valid. Okay? There's the other way you can look at that. Okay, so the first criteria for rendering the deductive argument sound is that it has to be valid. If I assume these premises are true, this conclusion has to be the case. Okay. Then this is where we actually are interested in the truth of the premises. Are all premises true? All premises are true. Okay. All it takes is for one of the premises to be false, and that would render the entire argument unsound. Okay. But provided you've determined that the argument is valid, assuming the premises are true, the conclusion has to be the case, and you've gone in and analyzed the premises and they all seem to be true, right? They're all true. Then and only then is the argument sound. Okay. So a couple things can make it unsound, right? It's not valid, or one, all it takes is one or more of the premises is false. Okay. What's interesting, as I point out at the bottom of slide 8, what is interesting about identifying an argument as sound, a deductive argument as sound? What's interesting is we're basically saying we should be betting our life on the conclusion, that the conclusion is going to be the case, because what we're saying is it's valid. So if I assume the premises are true, this has to be the case. And then you're also saying, well, in fact, these are true, right? Because you said all premises are true. Okay, so if these are true, then this has to be the case, and they are true. So this has to be the case. Okay, so that is again how you go about. So that's soundness there. That's how you go about assessing deductive arguments. And we'll we'll talk a lot more about validity and soundness, and we'll dive into much more detail in terms of deductive arguments again in the next section, particularly in the textbooks. I think it's chapters 8 and 9. But in the next section, right, we'll talk in much more detail about deductive and inductive arguments. Okay, but definitely know, right, for now, that what the main criteria are for assessing the deductive arguments. Okay, what a deductive argument is in the first place and how to identify it. Okay. While I'm thinking about it, I know that they did also in the text, they talked about the different types of deductive arguments and different types of inductive arguments. Oh, where was that? And what they reference, for example, categorical logic and truth functional logic on page 40, and they run through the different types of inductive arguments, causal arguments, inference to the best explanation, and so on. And be familiar with those in a general sense, know what each of those are at this point, and which is associated with inductive arguments and which is associated with deductive arguments. But I just wanted to mention we won't be worrying about those particulars too much at this point, because again, in the next section, we will be focusing on those in much more detail. So don't worry too much, for example, about truth functional logic at this point, because we'll be talking about that in much more detail in the next section, 2 lectures from now. Right? But know what truth functional logic is in a general sense, and know that it's related to deductive reasoning. Okay? So I wanted to, while I'm thinking about it, mention that. So don't worry too much about the individual kinds of inductive arguments at this point and the individual types of deductive reasoning that we'll talk about in much more detail in the next section. Just know, what they are in general, and which types are associated with which kinds of arguments. Okay. Okay, so I think that's all I want to do. Oh yeah, I want to give an example real quick of a deductive argument. I'm not going to put this one up here. So on slide 9, poor Michael Vick's great uncle. I've been using this example for quite some time. So the example is premise 1: all persons who eat a pound of arsenic will die within 24 hours. Now, what's interesting, that's all. I'll talk in a little bit later about indicator words. So we talked about premise and conclusion indicator words. Well, we also have indicator words. Here, I'm going to circle all here. We have indicator words for whether an argument is going to be inductive or deductive. And all versus most, that can make the difference, right? All is going to be indicative of a deductive argument, right? There's no exceptions allowed. Okay, whereas most, the idea is, again, even if that's true, there might be some exceptions, right? So it's going to be inductive. Okay, so my example here for a deductive argument, premise 1: all persons who eat a pound of arsenic will die within 24 hours. Premise 2: Michael Vick's great uncle ate a pound of arsenic at 11 o'clock last night. So what's the conclusion here? Michael Vick's great uncle will be dead by 11 o'clock tonight. Okay, so is that argument valid? So if we assume the premises are true, does the conclusion have to follow? So if we assume all persons who eat a pound of arsenic will die within 24 hours, if we assume that's true, and we assume that Michael Vick's great uncle ate a pound of arsenic at 11 o'clock last night, if we assume that's true, then we're asking ourselves, well, then does it have to be the case that Michael Vick's great uncle will be dead by 11 o'clock tonight? And the answer is yes, right? If we assume the premises are true, then the conclusion does have to be the case. After all, we said all persons who eat a pound of arsenic will die within 24 hours. We didn't allow for exceptions in the way it's stated. Okay, so that was indicative of it being a deductive argument. Okay, and again, given the premises, if we assume they're true, okay, then that conclusion has to be the case, which is why we're labeling it valid. Now, is it sound? Well, we know it's valid, but here's an issue here, right? I'm pretty sure all persons who ate a pound of arsenic will die within 24 hours. I don't even know the truth of that necessarily. I mean, I'm fairly confident that's going to be true, but I'm certainly skeptical of the truth of Michael Vick's great uncle eating a pound of arsenic at 11 o'clock last night. Okay? I don't even know if he has a great uncle still around, let alone eating pounds of arsenic on the regular, right? Probably not the case. And while I'm thinking about it, I also want to point out that a lot of the arguments, right, it's usually pretty clear whether a deductive argument is valid or not. Where a lot of the arguments, in the debate is then whether or not one or more of the premises are in fact true. And strictly speaking, right, if you don't know whether they're true or not, you're not in a position to actually say whether it's sound or not. Okay. A lot of times you just got to do the best you can do, right? You might not know, whether so-and-so did something at a certain time, right? I just want to point out that if that's the case, strictly speaking, right, you can't say whether it's sound or unsound because you don't know the truth of all the premises. Right? But in a lot of these examples, right, for example, this one, it's a pretty safe bet, right? We're going to assume that it's the case that Michael Vick's great uncle did not eat a pound of arsenic at 11 o'clock last night. So at least one of the premises is not true, right? It's false. So although this example is valid, right, it's not going to have all the premises be true, so it will be rendered unsound. So that's an example of a valid yet unsound deductive argument. So turning to slide 10, we'll turn our attention then to inductive arguments. Okay. So remember, logic, reasoning part, truth part. And hopefully it kind of makes sense why we're referring to them as such, right? Because here's where we actually dig in, do something more than checking out the logic or reasoning part. We check into the truth part, right? Are these in fact true? Okay. So now inductive arguments, the idea here is that it's supporting that conclusion. Okay, a good inductive argument is going to support, make this much more likely the case, right? These premises, okay? That's the idea behind a good inductive argument is whatever you're stating as reasons, make the conclusion much more likely to be the case. Okay? But there's not that element of necessity, right, as we've gone through with respect to the deductive arguments. Okay? I'm granting, and the person that's offering the inductive argument is granting that although these make this much more likely, there's still that chance that it's not going to be the case. No matter how strong of an inductive argument it is, insofar as it's inductive, there's always that possibility, right, that this isn't going to be the case. Okay, so because there's that element of necessity missing. So when it comes to inductive arguments, right, we want to erase this. Okay, but there's a lot of similarities, as we'll see. Okay, here we have conceptual terms of strength. This is my other one. Get out of here. And then cogency. Okay. So we're switching up our conceptual terms, but what we're up to is very, very similar, right, to what we just did with deductive arguments. So as I point out on slide 10, this is kind of in the middle, an inductive argument is strong if and only if the premises, when assumed to be true, make the conclusion much more likely. Okay. Then it's strong. Okay. So now this is a little tricky because you don't want to necessarily say that there's an on-off switch here. And this is what the authors, by the way, I mentioned that, this is what they're talking about when they say it's a relative sort of deal, whether an inductive argument is strong or weak is a relative sort of deal. And they're not going to employ the terms in an absolute sense. And so I mentioned, we're going to recognize that sort of point too. And so what they're basically saying is like, there's no like on-off switch here, right? Rather, it's a degrees, it's a spectrum, right? So, he's been late the last 5 days, he's going to be late today, right? That's an inductive argument. Premise being he was late the last 5 days. Conclusion being he's going to be late today, right? That's an inductive argument. Pretty strong, it seems like, but relatively speaking, it's weaker than this inductive argument for the same conclusion. He was late the last 7 days, right? Let's up the number of days. Therefore, he's going to be late today, right? Another inductive argument. That one is stronger, even though the first one seemed pretty strong, right? The more days that he was late, stated in our premise, right? Assuming that's true, he was late the last 20 days. Therefore, conclusion, right? He's going to be late today. That is extremely strong. That's way stronger, right? So there's that spectrum, okay? And that's what they're getting at. That's a relative sort of deal versus when you assess a deductive argument, right, as being valid or invalid. There's no spectrum, right? It's either on off, right? It either entails or necessitates the conclusion 100% or it doesn't, right? So there's that sense. There's not that relative sense. It's more absolute. It's either, strictly speaking, it's either valid or it's invalid, right? There's not that spectrum sense. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Now, having said that, for our purposes, so granting there's that element of, it's a spectrum, it's relative, and so on. For our purposes, we want to be able to identify it as either strong or weak. So we're going to kind of treat it as if recognizing that it is kind of a spectrum, that there is a whole slew of various degrees here. We're going to determine that it's either strong or weak. Okay, so we're going to treat it as if it's an on-off switch, for the sake of then analyzing it in terms of its cogency, among other things, right? So if it seems like, so in doing that, what's the best practice for that? Ask yourself, if I assume these premises are true, is it much more likely the case that the conclusion is going to be true? If the answer is yes, then label it strong, okay? If you can assume the premises are true and the conclusion doesn't seem that much more likely to be the case, label it as weak. Granted, again, there's, you can have a lot more argument about classifying it as such versus valid or invalid. I mean, again, there's very little arguments regarding that. Okay, given that this can be construed as relative, though, right? We could have some debate about whether or not that's strong enough to be labeled strong, right? Is that connection, right? How much more likely does it make the conclusion? Right. Granted, we could have a debate about what's requisite to render it strong. For our purposes, right? Label it either strong or weak, okay? And you're doing the same thing as you do with respect to validity in a deductive argument when you're trying to figure that out. Assume the premises are true. Don't care about whether the premises are true. Assuming they're true, right? Is it much more likely to be the case that the conclusion is true? Again, it's not proving. It's not a deductive argument here. We're talking about inductive argument. But assuming these are true, is it much more likely to be the case that the conclusion is going to be true? If so, label it strong. However, if we can assume these premises are true, whether or not they're really true, and yet it doesn't really seem like there's much reason to think the conclusion will be true just because of this, then label it weak. Okay. So again, if these don't seem very related, then it would be a weak argument. So he was late the last 5 days, therefore he's going to ace the exam. Okay. I mean, I suppose that can be construed as inductive, right? But the premises, you can assume that that's true, right? And it seems to have, if anything, it would have the opposite bearing than what's implied here, right? So that would, not be a strong argument at all. Okay, be rendered extremely weak, right? Because again, the premise seems to have nothing to do with the conclusion, or if anything, it would seem to intimate the opposite relationship, right? The more somebody's gone or late, the less good they're going to do. Or did I say that right? They're not going to perform as well on the exams in the course, presumably. Okay, so hopefully that's kind of making sense. I wanted to acknowledge their point about how this is a relative, it's like a spectrum, versus, there's no doubt about it, the validity with respect to deductive arguments is an on-off switch, valid or invalid. But granting their point, right, we're still going to, when it comes to homework in this course, right, when we are assessing an inductive argument, we're going to either label it strong or weak. And hopefully, again, you have an idea how to do that then, right? Assuming these are true, is this much more likely to be the case or not? Okay, if it is, label it strong. If not, label it weak. Now, what do you think we're doing with cogency? The next step, right? So we did the logic or reasoning part. Now we're doing the truth part with respect to inductive arguments. So this is very similar to soundness with respect to deductive arguments, right? but you don't use soundness when you're assessing inductive arguments. You use cogency. So the first thing, again, we have two check boxes, just like we did with soundness. Okay. First thing is it needs to be strong. Okay. Then here again, all premises, this is why it's the truth part, all premises are true. Okay, so all inductive arguments we're going to label as either cogent or not cogent. Okay, we're going to treat it as an on-off switch, not cogent. Okay, so there's two criteria, just like there was with respect to soundness in terms of deductive arguments. Right, two criteria here to render an inductive argument cogent. Okay, it's either cogent or it's not cogent. Okay, to be cogent, it has to be strong. So you might describe it right as going above and beyond the call of strength for an argument to be cogent, right? Because it has to be strong. Okay. If it's weak or not strong, you could also call it not strong, right? Or weak. If that's the case, you'll automatically know that it's not cogent. Just like if a deductive argument is invalid, you automatically know it's unsound. Right? So, cogent argument has to be strong. Assuming the premises are true, this is much more likely to be the case. And now you're going in and you're saying, okay, are these true? Is this true? Yeah, yes, yes. Okay, all premises are true. Okay. So that's a pretty good bet, right? You wouldn't bet your life because again, no matter how strong and good the inductive argument is, right? This is never necessitated or guaranteed. But if you're calling it a cogent inductive argument, I mean, you should probably be putting money on it, on the conclusion, right? Because you're saying, assuming these premises are true, it's very likely to be the case that this is true, and all those premises are true. Okay, so it's a good bet. Don't bet your life, but bet the farm, maybe. Depends on how strong the argument is, right? So if either one of these two criteria are not met, right, then it's labeled not cogent. Okay, so we have different conceptual terms, but in terms of what's going on in our analyses, it's pretty similar. Okay, so example of an inductive argument on slide 11. Most people, so most, ding, 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 indicative of inductive, right? Not deductive, right? Switch that to all, you have a different type of argument here. So premise one, most people named Brad have over $17 million. Premise two, your instructor's name is Brad. Conclusion, your instructor probably has over $17 million. So is this argument strong? We know it's inductive, right, because of how it's couched or the terms, right? Most, ding, 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 that's indicative of an inductive argument. It's allowing, right, that there could be an exception. Right? So most people named Brad have over $17 million. If we assume that's true, and we assume your instructor's name is Brad is true, then is it a lot more likely to be the case that your instructor probably has over $17 million? Yes, it is, right? Assuming those premises are true, then the conclusion is much more likely to be the case. Okay, now, so we call that a strong argument. As I intimated, a while ago, this is kind of funky for some rookie students because, obviously it's not the case that most people named Brad have over $17 million, unfortunately, right? That's not the case. So it can strike rookies as weird to call this a strong argument, right? When you're dealing with the premise that's so, obviously false. But again, when you're calling it strong, you don't care. It's not the truth part of the analysis, right? You don't care whether the premises are in fact true. You're just analyzing this connection between the premises, provided they're true, or assuming they were true, and the conclusion. Okay. So that is our example here is a strong inductive argument. Now, is it cogent? No, because while it's strong, one or more of the premises were false. Remember, all it takes is one to be false, okay, and then it's not cogent. Okay. And unfortunately, as I said, most people named Brad have over $17 million is false, at least in my experience. Okay, so I referenced indicator words already, so this is turning to slide 12. As I mentioned at the top of slide 12, pay close attention to universal statements in an argument, as they are always indicative of a deductive argument. And of course, that is a universal statement in itself, as I note there. Right, so whenever things are couched in universal terms, that's going to be deductive. Okay? And that gets at then this whole idea of indicator words and indicator phrases. So again, just like we talked about in the last lecture, you can have words that indicate either a premise or conclusion is going to follow. Well, so too, we have all sorts of indicator words that can signal that the argument you're confronted with is either deductive or inductive. And so we went through all versus most. Think about it like 100% of the time versus 99.9%, right? 100% is going to be identified as deductive. It's not allowing for any exceptions. So too, 0%, right? That would also be deductive. It's not allowing for any exceptions the other way. But anything in between, 99, let's say 0.999999, you get the idea. Inductive, okay? It's still allowing for an exception. Now this would be an incredibly strong, provided it's, this premise, whatever this was about, is well connected to the conclusion. I mean, it's probably gonna be a very, 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 very strong inductive argument, right? But it would be an inductive argument nonetheless because it's allowing for an exception. There's not that element of necessity, okay, versus this. Same thing with 0.00001%, still inductive, right? It's not 0. It's allowing for an exception. Okay? So all and none, those are typical deductive indicator words. None doesn't allow for an exception. All doesn't allow for an exception. Okay? Versus most, many, some. Okay, those are all going to signal, premises that do allow for exceptions, and hence an inductive argument. Okay. Turning to slide 13. So things can get a little tricky, as the authors emphasize on pages 44 to 46, when you're dealing with arguments, as I mentioned earlier, that might have unstated premises, and this happens a lot, unfortunately, in everyday life. Again, because a lot of times things might seem, very straightforward, and like something might seem so obvious that it need not be said, but then what happens is that sometimes, people won't recognize that there's an argument at play when there really is. And I talked about that at the beginning of this lecture. Anyway, so again, when you have an unstated premise, things can get kind of tricky. Does this person, right? How exactly does this person intend for the, what are their intentions? Do they think the conclusion has to be the case, or are they just merely trying to support the idea that the conclusion is the case, right? Is it deductive or inductive? It can be tricky to discern which it is, in particular when you don't have, when one of the premises is left unstated. So in those circumstances, you just have to do the best you can, as the title of the slide in the lecture suggests, right? Context matters. So you just have to go off what's said in the situation, in the context, whatever you have, okay, in those difficult situations, in those difficult circumstances, right? And identify the argument as best you can, right? Infer from what is said in the context whether the person most likely meant it as a deductive argument or an inductive argument. Okay, I do want to point out, so this is slide 14. We'll get into diagramming arguments here in a moment, but sort of kind of a thing that will come up more in that. You'll see it regularly. Well, not regularly, but you'll see how it is the case when you diagram arguments, is that you can have a claim or a statement that serves as both a premise and a conclusion. Hence the title of this slide. What is this again? Slide 14, right? Dual purpose claims. Okay. So the authors again talk about this on page 36. So you might have a claim that serves as a conclusion for one argument and then the premise for another argument. So my example, T-Bob didn't watch the Cats when he said he would. Sorry about the terrible handwriting. 2, basically people who don't do what they say are untrustworthy. Statement 3, T-Bob is untrustworthy. Oh my goodness. Okay. Statement 4, clearly we shouldn't ask T-Bob to watch Silly Sandy, although we should probably ask him to switch his name, change his name. Okay. So let's go through this one more time. T-Bob didn't watch, so imagine someone saying this to you, okay? With not so ludicrous of names here, but T-Bob didn't watch the Cats when he said he would. People who don't do what they say are untrustworthy. T-Bob is untrustworthy. Clearly, we shouldn't ask T-Bob to watch Silly Sammy, our beloved pet goat. Okay, so you notice here which claim serves as both a conclusion and a premise? This one, right? So we have two different arguments actually here, right? We have 1 plus 2 leading to 3, okay? And then we also have T-Bob is untrustworthy. That can serve as a premise then for 4. That's a reason for why we shouldn't ask him to watch our pet, right? So in this case, for that argument, it'd be this, okay? And if this is all interconnected, right, as I mentioned, or show on the bottom of that slide, right, it would be something like this. This is probably how I would label it, okay? And so that gets into our diagramming, right? So, and you can see how that then can kind of help clarify, right, the structure of the underlying structure of the argument. Okay? So that's an example of what the authors are talking about in terms of a claim or statement that can serve, a dual purpose within the larger context of what's being said. Okay, so in this case, we have two arguments at play. Okay? Again, and this indicates the arrows, and the diagram will kind of indicate then how many arguments are at play, right? Because you have, this is kind of like an inference, it signals an inference, or that the person wants you to reason that something's the case based on something else, right? So basically arguments, okay? So this is signaling, since this is diagramming everything that was just said, it's suggesting that there are two arguments at play, okay? And that also makes sense, right? And then, as we've been suggesting, statement 3 then is serving as both a conclusion and a premise, okay? Okay, so moving on to slide 15, I want to talk briefly about some common mistakes, okay, that rookies, you guys are all rookies, right, taking this intro course into logic and critical thinking. So some common mistakes that we want to avoid, okay. First of all, don't conflate the assessment terms. So even though they're very similar, right, don't assess a deductive argument using strength and cogency, and don't label an inductive argument as valid or invalid, right? So validity and soundness only applies to deductive arguments. Strength and cogency only apply to inductive arguments. Don't conflate those. Many rookies do. Okay? Also, it doesn't make sense to call an argument. This happens all the time. You have to be very precise as we proceed, okay? It's very important to be precise when proceeding in logic and critical thinking, okay? So I can't tell you how many times I hear arguments referred to as being true or false, or that's a valid claim, right? People referring to specific particular claims as being valid or invalid, or sound or unsound. Again, don't conflate these terms, right? It only makes sense to refer to claims, individual claims or statements as being true or false, not as arguments. So don't say that's a true argument, okay? Because arguments are always comprised, as I mentioned in the next slide, arguments never true or false, right? Because arguments are always comprised of at least two claims, right? You always need at least a premise and then a conclusion. Okay, so it doesn't make sense to refer to the whole argument as true or false, right? What happens if the premise is true and the conclusion is false? Okay, that's just meant to, and again, this could be false and this could be true. They could both be true, they could both be false, right? So in what sense are you calling the whole argument true? Okay, that doesn't make sense, right? Only individual statements or claims, okay, this whole thing is the argument, okay? So again, you don't call the whole argument true or false, okay? Only individual claims or statements are true or false, okay? And so too, you don't say the individual statements or claims that they're valid or sound or strong or cogent, okay? Those assessment terms automatically reflect, right, two or more claims, okay? For example, validity is assessing the connection between one claim, the premise, and the second claim, the conclusion, okay? So validity, those sorts of assessment terms, they're always dealing with at least two or more claims. So it doesn't make sense to speak of one claim, right, call the premise valid. No, you only speak of arguments being valid or invalid. You only speak of arguments as being cogent or not cogent, okay? Doesn't make sense to say the conclusion was cogent, okay? So I just want to point that out. So in sum, claims and not arguments are true or false. And arguments, not claims, are valid or invalid, sound or unsound, strong or weak, cogent or not cogent. And that's what the authors are also getting at when they say on page 47 of the text, quote, if it doesn't make sense to think of a thing as true or false, it cannot be a premise or a conclusion. And again, it doesn't make sense to think of the argument as true or false for the reasons I mentioned, right? It contains at least two or more claims, and they could be true or false individually, right? So continuing the quote, if it doesn't make sense to think of it as valid or invalid, and we talked about why that's the case for individual claims, or as being relatively strong or weak, it cannot be an argument. Okay. So before I go into diagramming an argument, I wanted to talk I think I was watching Dr. Sadler is his name, and he is with Fayetteville State University. He has some like a similar course, and so he has published his video lectures on YouTube as well. And so I'm giving him credit here because I like the way, I think it'd be helpful real quick to throw this up here. I like the way he kind of represented it pictorially, like what we're doing here. So this is kind of, most of this is borrowed from him, this representation here. Right, we have the idea of arguments, and we talked about sort of how to distinguish them. So should have left more room over here. So here the issue is, how do I want to put it? So I'm going to say the author, right? The author of the argument. What's the author's intent? Author's intent to prove or support conclusion. I think that is a nice way to summarize what, right, is a differentiating factor here. Okay. Then, right, we want to know in terms of assessment whether it's valid, in the case of deductive arguments, right, valid or invalid. And then, so, how do we want to put this? Let's call it the logical part, logical or reasoning part. Remember that, right? The logic part. Let's just summarize it that way. I know that's not what Dr. Sadler refers to it as, but that's what we're going to refer to it as. So this is the the identification process that we've referred to. Yes, there's an argument here. What type is it? Okay, now the assessment part, right? We're asking ourselves, okay, the logic part, and in the case of a deductive argument, right, we're saying is it whether it's valid or invalid. So the thing that I liked about what Dr. Sadler did was he's saying, look, right away we already know bad, okay? But then the idea is, what if it's valid? Well, there's still a way in which the argument can be bad, right? So we want good arguments. That's what we're after, right? So ultimately, when it comes to deductive argument, we want a sound deductive argument. So an unsound is also bad, okay? There's something wrong. So when I say bad, I mean there's something problematic or wrong with the argument, so that in the end, right, when it comes to deductive arguments, the person offering the argument thinks that their conclusion is the case, right? But for some reason, it doesn't have to be the case, right? They're wrong in thinking that. Okay, if we find it to be invalid or unsound. Okay. So as he pointed out, right, automatically, if you know it's invalid, you almost don't even have to go to the truth of the premises, right? Why even? I mean, in some sense, it depends on what you're up to, right? But if all you care about is whether the argument's any good, you could stop right here, right? If you can assume the premises are true, okay, and the conclusion can still be false, it's a bad argument, right? They're not successfully doing what they think they're doing, proving their conclusion, right? So you don't even really need to inspect the truth of the premises then. Well, are these premises actually true, right? You don't even need to go there if all that you care about is whether it's a good or bad argument, okay? You already know it's bad if you can assume the premises are true and the conclusion can still be false, okay? But let's say, it was valid, well then there's another way, right? If some of the premises are ludicrous, obviously false, right? Well then that's still a bad argument, okay? It's unsound because one or more of the premises are false. Okay, so that would be then the truth part, as we've been referring to it as, okay? So same thing here, strong, weak, bad. Hopefully this makes sense now. Then we have cogent, not cogent, bad. So I don't know. Another way to look at things, right? And by the way, I do encourage, if you're wanting another perspective, it always helps to hear it from someone else, I feel like. And this guy is Dr. Sadler. I watched a few of his videos. Again, he's basically, I think, teaching the same sort of course. And it's Dr. Sadler. I'm not going to try to even put this up here. If you just search it on YouTube, you'll find his videos. But Fayetteville State University. Okay? So I think a good sort of representation of what we're up to, another way of looking at things, if you will, right? And we're trying to avoid the bad, right? And we ultimately want to end up here if it's deductive, or here if it's inductive, right? At least if what we're after is good arguments. Okay. So we want to move on to diagramming arguments, okay? And it's actually a pretty straightforward, simple process. I think it can get a little tricky. Some of our exercises, they can get a little bit more tricky when it's kind of convoluted language and so on. But the underlying conventions that we use and employ are, I think, pretty easy to grasp. And it does help to, I think, again, diagram these arguments. So the authors go through it on pages 53 to 56 of the text. Okay. So you get a bunch of stuff, right, spewed out. I imagine all this is said. Okay. So on slide 17, I give you the general sort of three-step process. Now, so first step would be, as I mentioned, begin by circling all premise and conclusion indicators. Now, they used to say, I don't know why the authors stopped saying circle. They say, where is this? So they say, notice any premise and conclusion indicating words. They keep saying notice. I would like you to go further, and like I said, they used to say circle. Okay, so circle all premise and conclusion indicators. Let's pretend hence was here, and let's see. Let's just do this. Okay, so in this case, we have two indicator words, right? We know this is an indicator word for a conclusion, right? And this is an indicator word for a premise, common, right? At least when it's included in an argument, okay? So that's our first step, circle premise and conclusion indicators. The next step is, I don't really care whether you use slashes or brackets, right? But go through, and each individual claim or statement that can be true or false independently, right? Needs to be bracketed or slashed. So even though this is one sentence, there would be a slash here, right? Because there's two different individual statements or claims being made in that one sentence, which can independently be true or false, okay? And then finally, so part of that step two, sorry. So in addition to slashing or bracketing the individual claims, I guess probably don't need one there, right, is then you go through and number. I like to circle my numbers. Okay, so hopefully hopefully that makes sense now. So this is the same sentence. 4 and 5 are part of the same sentence, okay? But there's, again, two individual claims at play here. So then step 3, as I say on the bottom of slide 17, is just to finally display or diagram the structure of the argument using, right, those numbers, and then also using an arrow, okay, this is the other key feature of the diagram, okay, to signal like a logical inference, or basically it's signaling, that there's an argument at play, right? That whatever is above, right, they want you to then, the idea is that what's above, so let's say, again, nothing to do with that. Let's say we had circle 6 pointing to circle 7, right? Arrow to 7, right? The idea is here, whatever's above the arrow supports or proves, depending on whether we're dealing with an inductive or deductive argument, okay? But there's that element of this supports or proves the thing that's below it, okay? And so that's the sense in which there's an argument at play. So arrow indicates logical inference, or another way to think about it is that that's signaling that there's the argument, right? That whoever is presenting this, they want us to believe 7 on the basis of 6, okay? So again, you need those arrows to indicate where the logical inference is amongst these different numbered claims, okay? So this might look something like, let's see, what would this one look like? So maybe, I don't know. I mean, it could look something like this. Let's see, no, I want to do, I mean, it could be these first two things on their own, could be leading to 4, let's say. I mean, it could be whole. It would depend on what's being said, right? And then we might have, let's see, 3 and 5 together. Right, this could be it. Again, it depends on what exactly is being said. The thing I want to do here is just show you, what a possible diagram looks like, okay? So, so some things, I guess, moving on, slide 18. I already said what's at the top there, right? What the arrows signal, okay? Then I give you an example. Let me just put that one up there. So, again, this is slide 18. Let's say we had this as a diagram. Okay. What this is telling us, okay, is that this is offered as a reason to believe this, and so too this is offered as a reason to believe this. Okay. Now, since we have 2 different arrows, we have 2 distinct arguments. Okay. So the idea then is, whoever is saying this is meant to support this individually or distinctly from this. Okay. So taken independently, right? Their support doesn't depend on one another. Okay. So when this is the case, right, every arrow indicates that you can logically infer whatever's below from whatever's above. Okay, now as I move on to slide 19, if instead, I wish I could come up with an example on the fly. She's lied in the past. What else? She's stolen from people. She's untrustworthy. And those are 2 different things, right? 2 different reasons that can be taken independently that both support, right, the conclusion that she's, what I say, not trustworthy. Okay. But let's say that, like, we had modus ponens before, right? What was it? So what was our example? If it's a cat, then it's an animal, right? Remember this? And then Q. If it's a cat, then it's an animal. It's a cat, therefore it's an animal, okay? So the idea here is, so this would be 3, 1 and 2, okay? The idea here, though, is that, look, if it's a cat, then it's an animal. That by itself doesn't give you any reason to think it's an animal, right? So it can't be taken independently. Whoever's offering this argument, they're saying coupled together, right? If I know if it's a cat, then it's an animal. And if I know it's a cat, then I can infer, well, then it's an animal, right? So too, just because I know it's a cat, if that's all I knew, I wouldn't have license to infer that it's an animal, right? I also need to know that if it's a cat, then it's an animal is the case, right? So combine these 2, right? In this case, their support depends on one another, right? Then the idea is, right, then 3 will happen. Okay, so in this case, there's only one argument, right? These 2, right, are 2 premises for the same argument, intended to support, right, the same conclusion when coupled together. Okay. Let's see. So that was 19. Slide 19. And I guess I should point out, as I do on slide 20, that then you can also have, right, just as we had like 2 different arguments for statement 3, or 2 different distinct reasons given for statement 3. Well, we could have something stated that is a reason for believing two different things, right, or reaching two different conclusions. So the same statement might yield two different arguments, right? So the same thing might serve as a premise for two distinct arguments. Okay. So I want to point that out. So just let's erase that for simplicity here. That all could be the case, right? But this is what I'm pointing out on slide 20. So one statement supports two or more, okay? Then you'd have to indicate that with two distinct arrows, right? Or let's say it even supports another one. You know, anything's really possible. You got to diagram whatever's being said, right? Whatever the underlying structure is. Okay. So again, I mean, what we're doing at a basic level is pretty straightforward when it comes to diagramming arguments. Of course, it gets, like I said, a lot trickier than when you're dealing with convoluted language, and where, you know, so let's say you have 6 or 7 statements, right, and the connections, right, 1 and 2 might be linked up with 7, right? It can get kind of tricky when that's the case. No conclusion is one place and far away from the premises related to it, and so on. So I mean, I'm acknowledging that it can be kind of depends on, you know, what's being said and what arguments are being offered, but I would again emphasize though that the basic conventions are pretty simple, right? Go through, circle your premise and conclusion indicators, go through and then bracket or put slashes in between every statement or claim that can be taken as true or false individually, right? And then go ahead and number those, right, in succession. And then go ahead and diagram the argument using then the arrows to show where the logical inferences are taking place, right? Or that will then signal as well how many arguments you have at play. Okay. Okay, so let's conclude by discussing logical window dressing. So the idea here is, as I mentioned on the top of slide 21, be wary of extraneous or superfluous considerations, things that technically from a logician's perspective, from a critical thinker's perspective, should have no bearing on the merits, right, of our assessment of the arguments at play, right? That's what we care about from a logician's perspective, is the arguments and the merits of the arguments. We don't want to be swayed by other factors, okay? And that's what we have to be on guard against. And we've been warning, you know, talking about this for, you know, a few videos now, how the critical thinker's job in large part is to constantly be on guard against this stuff, to not just mindlessly proceed throughout life unaware of why we think and behave the way we do, right? So we have to be on guard as logicians when trying to identify and assess arguments. We have to be on guard against these sort of superfluous factors, if you will. So for example, as I mentioned in the bottom of slide 21, in most cases, our relationship to the person putting forth the argument shouldn't have any bearing on our assessment of it. Okay? We shouldn't let, for example, the fact that it's our father or our mother presenting the argument influence us when it comes to actually assessing the merits of the argument itself. Okay? Similarly, page 22, let's say they're, you know, let's say that's your favorite professor, right? You don't want that to unduly just sway you automatically, no matter what it is they're saying, right? And it works, so that would be what's called a positive ad hominem. If you let that sort of positive feature of the person that's delivering the argument influence your assessment of the argument itself, that's an example of what's referred to as a positive ad hominem fallacy. That's a mistake, right? We want to analyze, again, the merits of the argument itself, setting aside our positive feelings about, you know, our favorite instructor, right? But usually works the other way, actually. Most ad hominem fallacies aren't in the positive sense, right? It's usually like people dismissing what someone says because of negative features about that person's character. So for example, my example at the bottom of slide 22, you know, somebody says, don't believe Joe Blow, he's an alcoholic father. You know, don't believe what Joe Blow says about the death penalty, he's an alcoholic father. Well, look, not good to be an alcoholic father, okay? And, you know, certain character traits might give us reason to question the credibility of someone and so on. But strictly speaking, right, when it comes to what Joe Blow's arguments are for the death penalty or against it, his character, whether, you know, flaws or positives, has no bearing on what he's saying from a logical perspective, right? So we don't want to be swayed by someone who says that sort of thing. Don't listen to what Joe Blow says about the death penalty. He's an alcoholic father. Well, what does it have to do with his arguments for or against the death penalty? It has nothing to do with it. He might be the world's most evil, most despicable person, and yet offer the world's best arguments for or against the death penalty nonetheless. Okay, so again, our job is to not be unduly, well, to not be swayed at all by these extraneous factors. Okay? And it's a lot harder than it seems. Okay, we all like to think that we're not guilty of being swayed in these ways, but they're very common. Okay. Another sort of feature I point out, top of 23, right, of things you want to be on guard against, and we will go through a whole slew of rhetorical devices in the last section of the course, section 4, right? But rhetoric, okay, which the authors in the 9th edition defined, I like this definition, as, quote, language that has psychological force but carries no extra weight logically. So it's like, from a logician's perspective, it's like extra unnecessary baggage, right? And that's what we really have to be on guard against, because it's persuasive oftentimes, right? It can lead us to think things and be unduly swayed when we otherwise shouldn't be, from a, strictly speaking, from a logical perspective, from what the person's actually said logically, or the arguments themselves, what they presented, right? What we should be taking away from the arguments themselves, we're taking away more because of these, because we construed them as being more persuasive than they really should be, right? Hopefully that made sense. Again, I like the way they put it, the authors in the 9th edition, so going back 4 editions. They put the problem nicely when they say, quote, as consumers of thoughts and ideas, we must refine our ability to distinguish between the thought itself and the psychological packaging in which it is given to us. Okay, a large part of our job as critical thinkers and logicians is to sift through all that extra stuff and get to the meat itself, right? The actual arguments themselves, and just analyze those. Okay. So this is what, so they had that section towards the end of the chapter where they were talking about Aristotle and like the 3 ways that we can be sort of convinced of something. And so the authors are bringing this up because they're pointing out, right, we need to be on guard against what Aristotle referred to as ethos, which is basically like character traits, thinking highly of someone because they're our favorite professor, things like that, right? They're honorable. Okay? Just because they're honorable doesn't mean that they're putting forth good arguments, right? We need to be on guard against what he calls pathos, right? So ethos. Right? It's great to be a good dad, a non-alcoholic, however you want to put it, honorable person, okay? But all of that has no bearing, strictly speaking, on the merits of the arguments you put forward, okay? So as a logician, we got to be on guard against that, okay? And then also on guard against those emotions that can get the best of us, right? There's a reason why, people that are trying to persuade us of things, appeal to our emotions, right? Try to conjure up fear or anger or whatever the case might be to get us more likely to commit to their cause or whatever the case might be, right? So again, when it comes to analyzing arguments, we want to, as best we can, set aside our emotions, pathos, right? And instead, what we want to, for lack of a better term, let's call it logic, right? We want to emphasize the arguments themselves, the logic itself that the person's presenting, and from a logician's or critical thinker's perspective, analyze that in and of itself and try to divorce ourselves as much as possible from these, again, extraneous, superfluous factors, right? At least when they're superfluous when it comes to our goal as logicians and critical thinkers, right? To unpack the merit of the arguments that are being presented. Okay, well, moving on to slide 24. This is the end. Some concluding remarks. Basically, just wrap up by kind of summarizing, right? Evaluating, as I mentioned on the top of slide 24. Evaluating, right, arguments ultimately comes down to that 2-step process that I've been referring to throughout the lecture, right? What the authors and myself have been referring to as the logic part, asking ourselves how well whatever reasons are given for believing the conclusion actually link up and connect to and support or prove the conclusion. Right? That's the logic part, which they talk about in reference on page 57. And then also the truth part, right? We want to go in and ask ourselves, well, are these premises, are these reasons that are given to supposedly support the conclusion, are they in fact true? Okay? So those are the two parts of the assessment process, right? And I also mentioned again the identification process. Is there an argument here at all? And if so, what kind is it, right? But then when in terms of the assessment part, then yes, there's an argument, it's deductive or it's inductive. Okay, well, how good's the logical connection between the premises and the conclusion, logic part, and are the premises actually true or not, truth part. Okay, well that's it. That's it for this first section of the course as well. So looking forward to then the second section of the course, as I intimated earlier, we're going to then go in even more depth, right, and explore deductive arguments. The first couple of lectures, and the second section will be talking about deductive arguments, categorical logic, and then truth functional logic, and then we'll turn and focus exclusively on inductive arguments and go through all the different types of inductive arguments. So that's really going to be the emphasis of the second section of the course. And then previewing then the last half of the course, right, we'll get into then sort of other related issues, right? We'll set aside arguments per se, and in the third section of the course, we'll get into issues like clarity, credibility, other kind of related matters, but we won't be focusing on arguments like we do, here at the end of this first section, and then also in the second section of the course. And then we'll wrap up the course, the fourth section, talking all about fallacies, mistakes, and we've referenced some of them, right? Affirming the consequent, that common fallacious form of deductive argument, right? It's not a valid form. If P then Q, right? Q therefore P, okay? Not valid. It's a fallacy. We'll go through all kinds of various fallacies in the fourth section of the course. So hopefully you've enjoyed the course so far. Again, we'll be wrapping up section 1 of the course here. I'll go ahead and conclude by putting up, again, this is lecture 3, but it correlates to chapter 2 of the text. And so if you're taking the course, here's the homework. Okay. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you for the first lecture, lecture 4 of the next section, section 2 of the course. Thank you.